So I needed to make a quick slapdash video here. At this point, you've probably heard that Michael Brooks of the Majority Report and the Michael Brooks Show has died very suddenly. Apparently, it was a blood clot in his throat, according to his sister on the Majority Report today. It wasn't COVID related, as far as anyone knows, and it was not a suicide. It was just a sudden, random tragedy. He was only 37 years old, which is basically the same age as me. So, yikes. Obviously, my heart goes out to those who knew him personally. I know what it's like to have someone you see and work with every day just suddenly not be there anymore. I mean, my baby YouTuber ass never knew him and never spoke to him. I did think about calling into his show, on a couple occasions, but I never did. So I acknowledge that for many others, this is a far greater personal loss in addition to the loss for the movement as a whole that his death represents. But I wanted to make just a really quick video about Michael and what his work meant to me. So back in 2016, when I started getting back into politics, for some reason, I decided to start listening to left-leaning podcasts. I'd never really listened to podcasts before, so I just, I looked up the most popular left-leaning podcasts, and so of course I started listening to the Young Turks. I listened to some Chapo Trap House. I actually listened to Pod Save America for an embarrassingly long time, and of course I listened to the Majority Report, and the Majority Report turned out to definitely be my favorite out of all of those, and Michael was the co-host of it, and Michael was fucking hilarious, and not just hilarious, but also insightful. It was a rare time that he opened his mouth and I didn't learn something. So when he started his own podcast, I immediately started supporting him on Patreon, and I listened to almost every episode of his show. I've not talked about it on this channel, but Michael Brooks may have been the most formative person for me in terms of my political growth over the last few years. I think part of the reason I never talked about it was because somewhere in the back of my head, I knew that I was so heavily influenced by him that I just kind of had this feeling like people would know that I get all my takes from him and I don't think for myself, which is obviously nonsense. And of course, I'm wary of tying myself up to other leftist creators who seem to step in shit quite regularly. But I think when it comes to Michael, this wasn't something I really needed to be concerned about. I tweeted out last night that he was someone who was opposed to cancel culture, but was willing to suck it up and apologize when he received reasonable criticism. He wasn't in this to aggrandize himself. He wasn't doing this to fill his spare time like I am. He did the work that he did because he wanted to make the world a better place for everyone. And he did that with a combination of confidence, insight, and humility that I can hardly hope to emulate. So that is what Michael Brooks meant to me as an individual. But far more important than that is what his loss means to the cause of creating a just post-capitalist world. Not only did he rise above the typical divides that tend to plague us so much here on the left, and you can see that by the sheer number of people who are mourning his death on Twitter, but he had a way of contextualizing issues that are often lacking in our circles. Something that Michael truly focused on was talking about the international dimension of any issue that he talked about. When he spoke of working class struggle, he spoke of it as a worldwide struggle, and it is something that I have tried to do in my work as well, albeit not as strongly or consistently. It's something that those of us who live here in the Imperial Core really need to keep in mind and try to fight that tendency to focus on US politics. Even left YouTubers who live outside of the US have a tendency to focus on the US. And of course, I understand that literally no one can ignore the politics that go on here in the States. They affect the entire world. But, you know, what goes on in South America and the Caribbean and Africa is hugely important. And I think fighting that tendency to focus on just the domestic is something that we really gotta stay strong on and keep doing. It's something that I really need to work on personally. Another thing that Michael Brooks strongly advocated for was thinking strategically when it comes to fighting the good fight. I would not say that I have a mind for strategy, but Michael did. And I think that really bears out in his support for the Bernie Sanders campaign. He fought really hard for that because he recognized the kind of opportunity that a Sanders presidency represented, and he had no illusions about what victory in that arena would mean. He totally recognized that it was the beginning of a fight, not the end of one. And when Sanders lost, he didn't spend the next few weeks mauling over the DNC or shitting all over Biden. He just said, look, I'm not voting for Biden. I live in a safe blue state, so it doesn't make a difference. If you live in a swing state, you should strongly consider voting for him. But then he just moved on to the next fight. He knew that the presidential election was not the best place for his energy, certainly not at that moment. A lot of times I think we can get locked up in the minutia or, stuck on a single fight that will miss the broader picture. And Michael was an important counterbalance to that tendency. The third thing that Michael advocated for that I recognize is really important, but I struggle with personally, is the importance of spirituality on the left. Now, I know I'm never going to be able to really do this. In my upcoming video, I kind of take a dig at some spiritualist woo, and I'm not going to change it because I'm just cracking a few jokey jokes. I don't think I'm being too harsh. But I did want to say here that I recognize spirituality as a important cultural dimension that we cannot afford to dismiss or ignore. Spiritualism tends to be the domain of the right, liberals, Silicon Valley, techno hippies, and, us socialists tend to have the reputation of being godless communists. Then that's me to a T. I came to my atheism pretty naturally. I dabbled in Buddhism and whatnot when I was a teenager, but I just don't have a spiritual bone in my body. Most of the time when people talk in religious or spiritual terms, it just sounds like gibberish to me. However, I recognize that that's not because it is gibberish. It's just something I have an inability to grasp. But that doesn't mean that I don't recognize that leaving this cultural dimension as the domain of liberals, I recognize that that would be a monumental mistake. Socialism is, on a certain level, a deeply moral position, and there's a hell of a Christian socialist tradition, for example. I don't really know how to talk about this stuff. Like I said, Michael did, but I understand that it's something that we could all really stand to be more open to if you have the inclination to do so. So, I'm gonna wrap this up, but before I do, I wanted to talk about something that's not so much a thing that Michael advocated for, but more something he embodied. And it's something that I've tried my damnedest to emulate. Michael was very approachable and relatable. A lot of socialist media can be a bit alienating. We become insular in our rhetoric and our thinking, but Michael didn't engage in that. He was always reaching outward to grow the movement. He didn't use clunky terms like praxis, bourgeois. He talked like a normal person, and when he spoke about issues, he spoke about them in the broadest working class terms, and he tied that in to an international working class struggle. He recognized that the left couldn't both win and be an exclusive social club at the same time, and he acted like it, which is more than I can say for a lot of people with similar politics. And I include myself in that, lest you think I'm throwing shade at anyone in particular. We could all stand to be a lot more like Michael. So, I'm going to leave it at that. This is a pretty huge loss, so stay safe, stay radical, talk to each other, comrades. Cheers.